Afternoon, very lovely sunny day. My name is Claire Melamed. I'm the CEO of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, which is delighted to be one of the co-conveners of this workshop. The others will introduce themselves in due course. This issue, we've come here today to talk about aligning values across communities of practice. And that's very much at the heart of everything that the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data does. We were created to be the common link, the pipework, I sometimes say, which connects different data communities, brings together those who are concerned with official statistics, those whose business is data science, those in the civil society community who are concerned about data rights, and those many others in universities, in the private sector, in civil society and across government, whose business one way or another is data and the use of data to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and improve the world we live in. I think we've all become very more than ever aware this year of the importance of data as all of our societies have struggled together to overcome the impact of the pandemic. And we've all seen, I think, and experienced in our own lives in different ways, the critical importance of data as a tool to help to overcome those challenges and to provide the maps that can guide government resources, government activity, partnerships, and of course those actions, our everyday actions, which have been so affected and constrained by the policies that have been put in place to try to tackle the pandemic. I think also, though, as we've focused on the importance of data, it's also brought home to us, to all of us, some of the challenges that exist in trying to use that data in a way that genuinely serves the interests of societies and particularly their most vulnerable members in the longer term. And I think we've all, at one time or another, been made very aware this year of some of the trade-offs and the challenges that exists as governments try to use data both to expose problems and understand them, but also to do so in a way which is sensitive to rights and to the long-term interests of societies and isn't simply setting us up for greater challenges and risks further along the line. So I think today gives us a fantastic opportunity to discuss some of these topical issues for the longer term. Here at the Global Partnership, we're very proud to be working with many of you on the Data Values Project, which is all about bringing together our enormous network of, at the time of speaking, around 280 partners who are all coming from different worlds with different concerns, but coming together with a common focus on the values that underpin the production, the analysis and the use of data, and how we can make sure that our practice is rooted in those values and contributes to building the better world that the Sustainable Development Goals are really all about. So in bringing together this huge network to try to establish what are our common data values, how can we define them, how can we agree them, and once we know what they are, how can we use the power of the network for advocacy, for influence, and to underpin our own practice to really make sure that those values are used as the basis for policy choices, for programming, and for decision making across the wide spectrum of institutions which are so relevant and important and brick by brick are building the data ecosystems of the future. It's going to be a fantastic discussion. I'm really excited to listen to you all, and I want to hand over now to my colleague David Sadieno, the Director of Programs at the Global Partnership, to lead us through the first discussion. Over to you, Davis.
Thank you so much, Claire, for that introduction and overview. Really nice to meet all of you. Great pleasure to have such a wonderful panel speaking to us about some pertinent questions related to data governance. We have Dr. Sema from SIGO Foundation. We also have Mola from the Africa Center of Statistics at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and Ross Mosero, who is the Legal Regulatory Policy Advisor at the newly created Office of the Data Protection Commissioner in Kenya. And congratulations on the establishment of that particular office. It's been a long time coming, being based here in Nairobi. Really proud to be associated. We'll start with you right away, Dr. Sema. Based on the work that the SOGO Foundation has been doing in Africa, globally, and some of your experiences doing this work, really, how has COVID-19 impacted your view, but also the views of SOGO Foundation and maybe some of your partners when it comes to data governance and related challenges?
Great, thank you so much, Claire. Thank you so much, Davis. Just a correction, we're now called Servo Ventures. We changed our name, so thank you for having me today, and great panel and great topic. Before I jump in, let me just give some background about the type of work we're doing in Africa on COVID, just to set the context. So Servo as an organization, we're all about data. Our mission is really to use data to be able to deliver precision solutions when it comes to health, knowing that resources are limited. And we also take a very rights-based and an equitable approach to the way we look at data and the insights that we generate to drive action on the ground. When the pandemic hit a year and a half ago, I think as everyone else, we realized that there were a lot of questions that they needed to be answered, but there was also a need for a lot of information and insight to actually drive the action on the ground. And there was very limited data. So we were trying to solve for that. So I'm going to talk about two data tools that we developed to set the context and how that governed our actions. One was the development of a Africa COVID-19 Community Vulnerability Index. This was a pan-Africa tool which assessed 751 regions across 48 countries to really be able to proactively say, in the absence of good surveillance data, which regions of Africa were going to be hit the hardest when it came to the impact of COVID, whether it's the health impact, but also importantly, the economic and the social impact of COVID. So that was one. The second was the 321 symptom tracker. So this was a phone-based system where individuals across 3 countries, Mali, Malawi, and Uganda, would dial in, be able to go through a symptom checker, but then importantly, they would receive information on their risk profile, as well as information in terms of what they could and should be doing next. So recommendations based on the symptom tracker. I think for us, we learned a number of lessons. One is the importance of being able to move really fast in the face of a pandemic. And how do you do that when there is such limited, well, I shouldn't say such limited data, but really limited data. So how do you leverage actually existing data sets and be creative about using those to be able to do predictions about the future? So one was filling that gap. The second was about how do you actually engage users directly, so participants on the ground, to be able to provide that kind of surveillance data to you, and so that governments can be able to identify hotspots across the country and then be able to really think about their response. But I think overall, when it comes to the rights-based data governance, it was really important to bring this framework into how we built those tools. So for example, all of our tools and methodologies are made open source, which means that anyone can interrogate how we design this data collection, how we're collecting it, and what are the gaps, and also what are the biases and limitations. The second is disaggregating data, so that we're not just getting a view, a national and an aggregate and a simplistic view, but really disaggregating it so that we're getting really localized views. Another example I will give is really privacy, respecting the privacy of individuals, especially they're providing their own data. And so how do we make sure that we get their approval and their consent? And finally, the other point I want to make is around engaging local partners, right? We are a global organization, but we work very closely with the ministries of health in these countries and very closely with local partners such as Viamo and the Clinton Health Access Initiative local offices to be able to do that work. But that's just a brief overview of what we do and what we did during this pandemic and how we address some of these issues. And of course, happy to dive deeper into much more to come.
Were there any suspicions from some of the government agencies that you are working with as to why and what and where do you want to use this data, and what are some of the reassurances that you actually gave them in terms of effective use of this data for social good?
I wouldn't say there were suspicions in terms of why and how we would use it, but there was definitely a need for engagement, extensive engagement, to really be on the same page in terms of what are we trying to solve for and how do we do this in a collaborative manner and how do we actually respect and follow the in-country procedures and protocols and approaches. So that engagement was absolutely critical, especially with the 321 symptom tracker, since we were collecting individual data. The other piece I will say is that there was a request by some governments actually to give them individual level data from the users. And I think, one of the things we agreed to that's actually not possible. We wouldn't be respecting their privacy. And so we came to the agreement of only providing aggregated, anonymized aggregate data. So I would say it was a very productive collaboration, making sure that we're meeting the needs of governments, but also respecting the rights and privacies of individuals in the countries from which we're collecting data.
Great, thank you. I'll come to you, Mola, shortly, but because we're talking about the likes of SAGO working with governments, maybe to you, Ross. What were your experiences? Were there people coming to you and for example, raising concerns about how data is being used for the COVID response? What were some of your experiences throughout that period?
Thank you so much for your question, Davis, and thank you to the panelists that are here and those that have invited me to come to speak today. It's great to be here. Davis, before I answer your question, I think I'll just give a background on the office, which will inform the response to your question. As some of you know, the Data Protection Act was actually enacted in 2019, November 2019, but an office holder wasn't appointed until almost a year later on the 16th of November 2020, almost about 9 months after the start of COVID-19. And so it's still a relatively new office, only having been in place for about 7 months. And I think because of that, there's still a lot of awareness that the office needs to do in terms of its being established. And this is something that we have to do not only for the government, unfortunately, but also for private sector. Data protection is also a very novel concept for Kenyans. And so in terms of the questions that we get, sometimes it's not necessarily that government agencies will come to us regarding the data that has been requested to be shared, or contracts between private sector agency or non-government agencies dealing with COVID data, but really seeking guidance on just the application of the Act in general, because this is something that is not known to governments agencies here. And so a lot of our work since the establishment of the office is pretty much being awareness of the existence of the Data Protection Act, even though it's been in place for almost a year and a half. One of the things that we've embarked on as a regulator is establishing regulations which will effectively govern how or give it implementation, some sort of implementation, guidance and clarity to how the Act will be implemented. And with this, there have been 3 draft regulations that have been established. One is for just general regulations that looks at the procedures and enforcement of rights of data subjects. The other is registration of data controls and data processors, which is something that's mandated under the Act. And the other is compliance and enforcement. All of these are draft regulations. So to answer your question, yes, we have received quite a number of requests from government agencies, specifically when it comes to dealing with non-government players and exchange and sharing of data. With that, we did publish a draft guideline on how data sharing should be conducted, especially when it comes to sharing between private sector and non-government agencies and government. And we recognize as an office that there is a need for us to balance the rights of data subjects, but also to ensure that we're giving consideration to the situation that we find ourselves in with this pandemic. And there's a need for research and insights to whether it's contact tracing, whether it's medical information as to how to combat the situation. In Kenya, we've dealt with issues of food security, where if there's lockdowns, there are people who are from you know, a less, I guess, in vulnerable positions or in informal settlements needs to be provided with some sort of security, whether it's food being brought to them or payment so that they can afford to still be able to sustain themselves even during the lockdown. So there's been an interesting balance in terms of this, where we need to look at obviously the rights under the Act, but also balance the need to ensure that there is a safeguard of these data subjects that do need resources given to them, but also in terms of the economic good and the general health of the nation, to be able to ensure that there is a again, I'll use this term, there is a balance of interests between data subjects and I guess national security, as well as and national security in this term being used very broadly in terms of economic and food and health security of the nation.
Thank you so much. And maybe just quickly, are the regulations being put in place to directly respond to COVID, or you have in mind, you know, the future, and thinking much more broadly around data governance, data protection, privacy, or you're basically saying when it comes to COVID-related data or individual data, so that these provisions can live beyond the COVID pandemic?
I think with every regulatory process, you can't necessarily just look at the now. There needs to be a futuristic view, and so we have catered for some of the aspects that, such as COVID, and looked at issues of we've termed them as public health situations, which look at public interest situations where there's things such as a pandemic that we find ourselves in. But we have the regulations are very forward-looking, and so they would, if and when they come into place, we hope that they will come into place in about August or in the first half of the next financial year, that they will be something that would apply and live beyond just the COVID era, and look at what institutions should do post-COVID in terms of data governance and good governance when it comes to data protection.
Great, thank you. Mola, the Africa Center for Statistics deals with the broad range of stakeholders, and I'm sure data governance is one of those key considerations when it comes to either acquisition, generation, or sharing of data. What has been the experience of ECA, you know, throughout the COVID pandemic, and some of the related challenges around stakeholder engagement, and some of these questions coming up?
Okay. Thank you for having me here with these distinguished panelists. I have been with the official statistics system for the past 17 years on the various aspects of data life cycle. I have witnessed the changes over the years in statistical landscape. The past 5 years or so have been unprecedented pressure to deliver on data and statistics, and also to expand the ecosystem to include other players, other stakeholders, rather than the traditional government departments, agencies, and ministries that used to produce data. I think this is very critical for the statistical system, especially to expand the ecosystem. But when it comes to data, the type of data we collect in the official statistics system, I think there is no much change, like in terms of the type of data. But there are 4 areas that have been affected. One is granularity, the details of data, which in some cases goes to individuals, institutions, households, and stuff like that. The other is looking at, in a context, a relationship, the association of data. Like when we talk of COVID data, it's not about only the mortality, the prevalence, the incident, and stuff like that. But what is the impact on environment, infrastructure, mobility, and that has to be looked in the context. I think it needed for the decision maker to have effective decision. This has to be looked at. So this is a lesson we are learning from the COVID pandemic in terms of data. The third is the frequency. I think in the official statistics, we usually talks about, again, I said national data, maybe subnational at one below national level, but we don't go deeper. but we need data in real time now. Not only now, we need also to project the data. I think in this context, the models have become very important. I think there is a saying in statistics, all models are wrong, but some are useful. I think models have been very critical. We need to know the future, the next epidemic, the next cycle. This is very critical, and we are seeing witness on that. The last one is the type of users have expanded. We always talk. We have the public, the media, the academic, the researchers, and this is the usual talk. But we are now witnessing the request data coming from at all levels, and they are critical about it. They are questioning our data, and that is also one of the area that we have also witnessed is the metadata. In the statistic, we talk about metadata. What is the definition? What is it really talking about in terms of quality, timeliness? But when you look at COVID data, it's not like harmonized. It's not the same across. The number of incidents per population, what we say in one country is not comparable. I think that is also have become very and have become like a mainstream conversation. The other point I would like to make is the impact to deliver, as I said, the use of technology. We are stretching the technology to use. I think you guys know what we do, like in terms of the use of mobile device for data collection. Not only replacing the paper, but we are also asking people to respond to the self-enumeration, because of the contact and the issues around COVID. And the other point we're looking at is the use of social media, big data. We've been discussing this in the past couple of years with the working group on the use of big data for official statistics, but that has become mainstream. We need really to use satellite imagery, social media to really look at the issues in terms of data. And I think in the future, the majority of obtaining data for official statistics will be coming from these non-traditional sources. I think as a starter, I can stop here, but
maybe just to come back to that, because that's a huge body of work, and the spectrum of the thematic areas and the types of data are quite large. Are there specific governance frameworks that are being put in place or being discussed to make sure that even if we are going to be using all these new complementary sources of data, that the fundamental basis of ensuring we protect rights, the governance frameworks are in place, will actually be there to support this really rapid expansion of data sources.
Yeah, in statistics, what we call the 10 principles of official statistics, and we talk about ethics, privacy, confidentiality, but that issue has been discussed in statistics landscape, but has become very critical when it comes to COVID, because but in Africa especially, we discuss those issues, but we don't have also the legislation, the Statistics Act, especially when it comes to the digital age. Data can be disseminated, in light speed, I would say. And if you don't have the right protection, the right legal system, it's very difficult to protect privacy and confidentiality. On top of that, besides to the legal issue, we need also to look at the ethical issues behind it. You can have a legislation, but ethical issue, you cannot legislate, every ethical issue. We need also to teach, data literacy comes into picture. So this is the conversation we have in the statistical system happening now. And I think the technology innovation is out there, but this is something that really needs to really looked at. There is a conversation, but the conversation is mainly happening with the other stakeholders. That's why we need to engage other stakeholders. The private companies are discussing hugely on data privacy issues to protect customers and stuff like that. The civil society is discussing, but the statistics community is not really engaged very well when it comes, apart from putting, the principles, the framework. So that's what I would say. Yeah.
And thank you so much, Mola. And Sema, just responding to that from a Sago Ventures perspective, do you see that? It seems like, you know, the statistics community is being left behind, if I were to say. And what really needs to happen in terms of engagement with private sector that can then improve some of these aspects related to data governance and having frameworks in place, because the private sector tends to do it quite well, but often it's to protect trade secrets and profits and everything else. Are there lessons that could be learned by governments?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I agree with everything Mala said. I mean, I think it's an exciting time because when it comes to like granularity and frequency and combining different data sets, I mean, COVID has shown how important that is. But going back to the data framework issue, I think one of the issues is that now you have so many different sources and players of data. How do you make sure that you have one common framework? And different parties are not using different frameworks. Like that was, for example, one of the challenges we had when we create our tools. We actually combine data from many different sources, from Google, from national surveys, from Facebook, but all of them potentially have different frameworks. So I think, and I'm curious to hear Rose's comments actually on this, is how do you, when you're bringing in different players who are collecting their data and who have their own frameworks, from a national perspective, how do you actually make sure that you are all within that one framework? Because I think more and more, it is really going to be about integrating and combining many different types of data and very unique, not traditional types of data, that, for example, statistical offices have been using. So yeah, that's my comment, and I'm really curious to hear Mola and Rose's points on this.
Thank you for asking the question for us. Rose, you have around 2 minutes to respond to that, and then we could wrap this particular session. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. From a data protection perspective, I think there's something called the data protection impact assessment, which effectively the Act calls for it to be done if there is an integration of two different data sets, because that integration of data sets, especially when it's done through electronic means, are likely to actually have an impact on the rights of a data subject. And so from that view, that risk assessment, which is done in the impact assessment, would usually help the different players who are integrating actually come together to then clean up, I guess, the data sets. But when it comes to a statistical point of view, when you're just having, I guess, anonymized data, then there is complications with this because the Act doesn't actually provide for that. And so we still have that lingering issue that Mola has spoken about in terms of how then do you integrate two data sets that might not necessarily have personal data or identifying information, and how do you have them linked together to give you some sort of usable information that you can come out of it. So I'm actually interested to hear what Mola has to say, but from a perspective on data protection, there's always that risk analysis that one has to do when they're bringing together that the two different data sets, so to speak. Back to you, Davis.
Great, thank you. There's a risk that we could actually take half a day discussing this. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time today. And so I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Tom. A lot of conversations are happening at the global level, at the regional level, when it comes to some of these really difficult issues, and multi-stakeholder perspectives are coming in to really try and formulate normative positions and find ways in which all these different stakeholders could actually come together. So Restore Data Rights are doing a great job of really asking the difficult questions and asking all of us to really try and sign up to commitments that will ensure we adhere to some of these principles, address some of these risks and related issues. Over to you, Tom. Thank you so much, my panelists. That's all the time we had for this particular session, but of course we'll be following up with you to delve deeper into some of the pending matters. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Davis, and thank you very much to the panelists from that first discussion. Really, really interesting. And I do hope that you can stay around for the conversation at the end, because it would be really good to get a bit of a conversation going between some of you and the panelists in this session, and also, of course, our guests and attendees. while you were all talking, I was trying to quickly just summarize some of the issues that you were raising so that we could integrate the conversation as much as possible, because I think you raised some incredibly important points. We've heard about 3 specific categories of challenge, I guess, that I could summarize from your discussion. Sema highlighted the expectation gap that sometimes exists between the private sector and governments in terms of what should be made available to them and what shouldn't be made available to them. Governments may request access to personalized, identifiable information. However, sometimes it's important to put pressure on them and to kind of fight back a bit and refuse to provide that if it would go contrary to the laws of that country or international best practices or international standards, whatever the case may be. So there's an expectations gap, which is sometimes deeply political, that I would like to talk about a bit with this panel. Rose also highlighted, the incredible challenges that come with starting from scratch, essentially. Kenya has just passed the Data Protection Act very recently. It's had a couple of landmark cases in its courts already about the Huduma number and the rights of minority groups there, and about other issues. But establishing a whole new institution and office and raising awareness amongst the public and private sector about its role, and again, trying to find its place within government as the regulator of these issues, is going to raise an enormous number of practical challenges and capacity challenges and knowledge challenges. And finally, Mola, highlighted the unprecedented pressure that the statistical systems around the world now face, not just because of COVID, but because of the data revolution more broadly, and the pressures that they face to modernize and to do things differently than what they've done in the past. And again, with that comes risk, the demands for granularity, for higher frequency, as Sema pointed out, and for the combination and recombination of different kinds of data, all raise quite serious data protection and privacy issues and challenges moving forward. So there's an incredible amount to discuss. And this has been a great session so far, because we've heard from practitioners in the development space about what they've been doing and how they've been addressing those challenges in the context of COVID. And as we start to talk across communities of practice, I'd like to turn now to our panelists who are all working on initiatives, amongst other work, which focus on digital rights and digital inclusion and on data rights and that side of data governance, because I think it's important to recognize that data governance is a broad church that covers lots of different kinds of issues. So without further delay and without any more background and speaking from me, I'd like to invite my first panelist, Al Kaggs, to introduce himself very briefly, and also to just describe the initiative that he's working on, the Restore Data Rights Initiative, and how he sees that being relevant to some of the issues that have been raised in that first panel.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Al Kaggs, and I'm really excited to be here. The Restore Data Rights is an initiative that is an Africa-driven initiative, and that is driven by primarily several civil society organizations, as well as others who have joined and supported and grown it over time. When we started the Restore Data Rights, the initiative was to try and get governments to think about how to wind down the transgressions or the taking over of citizens' rights as a result of COVID-19. Some of these rights that we're talking about are things like the right to privacy that has had to be pushed aside, because of contact tracing and that sort of thing, the right to movement and so on and so forth. The big question we were asking at the time was, at the end of, what is the signal that we shall have that we are at the end of COVID-19, so that then people can ensure that their rights are put back. But then as we were going, we realized that there are many other situations where people's rights were being taken advantage of, even where there is no real need for it. A very good example for this is if you've been to Kenya, I'm not sure about other countries, but if you've been to Kenya and you've been to some of our buildings, you're required to give your passport or ID card and leave it with the security downstairs as you go into the building. And then when you come back, you can pick it back up. Or at the very least, write down your details, name, phone number, ID number, almost bank details on this thing that I call the Book of Truth, which is a big black book that just has people writing all this information. I call it the Book of Truth because I never write the truth in there. I put a fake name, I put a fake phone number, I put fake everything. But there's lots of people who actually put in their actual real details in there. And it's frightening what can be done. In Kenya, certainly that data is being used to be sold to fintech companies who then contact us, do unsolicited calls to us to say, take loans for free, that sort of thing. Now, as we have been going, we realize that even as we are talking to policymakers, such as the esteemed group of panelists that are here, as we're talking to policymakers and people who think about such things at policy level, we realize that there's a gap. And that gap is the fact that majority of the citizens don't really understand very much to do with data protection and that sort of thing. As we were going on, we were really excited that the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner here in Kenya was, engaged and started to come to life. And we realized that there's a gap there in terms of helping citizens to understand what they can do with it. So over the last couple of months, I think this is what is the most recent thing that we have done under the Restore Data Rights initiative here in Kenya, is that we have ran a public campaign to try and get people to understand A, what data is, B, what data protection means, C, why they need it and why it is important, and finally, if their data, or if they feel that their data is being misused, then how do they engage with the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner? I don't think I'm allowed to share my screen, but I would have actually shown you what the campaign looks like. But the real intention here is to make sure that then citizens become part and parcel of the conversation around data protection and the usage of data for purposes of gain. Now, why is this all important? The reason it's important is because one of the realizations that we have done as we've been having data governance conversations, in Africa throughout the time that we've been working on RDR, is that we have realized that the discussions around data, its governance, its use, and so on, are very elitist conversations. They are conversations that by their very nature often exclude entire populations of people who should know about it and who should help even in terms of the advocacy efforts that need to be done to ensure that people's rights are protected. But because of the fact that they don't even know why this data is important, how it affects them, what is the impact on their daily bread and so on, you find that then there's a real gap. And that's what we've been doing. I think I'm going to stop there and then, allow for a little bit of conversation as we go.
Thank you very much, Al. Really, really interesting there to hear, especially about, those links to people directly. I think that's absolutely crucial. And, I know the size of the consultation that you've undertaken, and if I'm not mistaken, it's hundreds of thousands of people that you've engaged with. And I'm sure you can talk a bit more about that in a moment. But I'd like, having spoken about that last point in particular, about the need to connect with people directly, I'd like to turn to Jenna, who's at the GPSDD and is managing the Data Values Project, to tell us a bit more about that and to tell us a bit about how she sees the added value of that Data Values Project in this space, and what the opportunities are and what the lessons have been as well from the COVID experience.
Great, thanks, Tom. Thanks so much for having me here today, and thanks to all of the panelists so far. Such a fascinating conversation. I've really appreciated it. So as Claire said when she opened the event today, the main intention of the Data Values Project is to bring the diversity and breadth of the global partnership network together and to draw on the insights that comes from the great work of the very many different partners that are part of the network to almost take a step back and come back to sort of basics or first principles and say, what are our values and how should those be underpinning our practice and our advocacy? You know, in the data for development community, we have since 2015 when the SDGs were agreed, but really before, been very staunch advocates for an optimistic view of the possibilities of using data, unlocking the value of data for social good. Certainly we haven't let go of that. But there's a really strong recognition, and I think it's been really discussed well in the event so far, that we can't do that at the expense of people and their rights. And the question we're all asking ourselves is, how do we not navigate these complex challenges? One of the things that I think the Data Values Project recognizes implicitly is we really need to get out of our echo chambers, that we find ourselves sort of speaking to each other. In the official statistics community, in civil society communities, even in sub-communities of these larger groups in private sector. And we're not doing a great job of speaking across these communities and really making explicit where we have fundamentally different assumptions, where we might need to question those assumptions, where we need to hear from sectors, stakeholders, organizations that may not agree with us. And by sort of surfacing that, our aim is to really articulate, what do we really stand for? What can we agree on? And how do we ensure that that informs our practice? And for the global partnership, informing our practice means informing the partnerships that we broker across communities to solve specific and concrete challenges at national level. How does that inform our practice going forward then more broadly, as Claire said, and as all of the different parts of the quote global and national data ecosystems are kind of making decisions and building for the future. So that's broadly what the Data Values Project aims to do, and more specifically have a really open dialogue period over the next 5 or 6 months, and from that distill some key messages. We also recognize that there are going to be areas where consensus cannot be found in our community yet, and where there's a need to kind of continue to push the conversation. Well, what's really the added value of doing this for us and for the community, for the data for development community and for other communities out there? I think this divide between the sort of data optimists and the data pessimists when it comes to development is like quite broad. And it's not sufficient to sort of speak past each other anymore. And what we're lacking is an effective sort of movement that articulates at the level of values and principles, how can we move forward in a balanced way? And then in very practical terms, how do we actually do that by leveraging the examples and good works of different partners that are experimenting. So for example, the example that Al just gave of the consultation, how do we, and Al is one of our esteemed technical advisory group members, along with a few other people on the panel today, how can we learn from the work of Restore Data Rights, groups like the Open Institute, for engaging citizens, for taking the elitism out of the conversation. That's not usually something that global organizations are that good at articulating, no matter how hard we try. That's where we need to hear the examples of groups on the ground and bring those to global conversations, explain how it works, compare different examples, and understand what can be done. So there's an element of a kind of core values and principles. Then there's the how might that work in practice? What are some of the ways that that can work in practice? And how do we feed that into an advocacy that is more than the sum of its parts, right? So as Claire said, we have a network in the global partnership that's just surpassing 280 members now. Where does the combined advocacy of a group that has that breadth and that diversity, how can that push and influence in a really valuable direction to ensure, that we can unlock the value of data for public good while ensuring that the safeguards and protections are in place? So those are some of the ideas around the Data Values Project, and happy to provide a bit more detail, but back to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Jenna. A lot to unpack there, and it would be great, I think, in the discussion component of this to explore that a little bit more. But I think turning to Benga, this is a great opportunity actually to start to talk across different communities, because Benga, from the Paradigm Initiative, who's joining us from Nigeria, has a long track record of working as a digital and cyber rights activist in Nigeria, regionally in Africa and globally. And I think that his perspective is absolutely crucial to this kind of discussion. So Benga, I'd like to invite you perhaps to describe your work in a bit more depth for this community of practice generally here, which is more development oriented, so they can get an idea of the types of issues that you deal with. And then also it would be very helpful, I think, to hear of perhaps 2 or 3 examples of the types of live issues that COVID has really thrown up when it comes to digital rights, and how they manifest in the pessimistic way, if I can borrow from Jenna's way, although I would challenge Jenna and say that perhaps instead of data optimists and pessimists, we have data idealists and data realists. But that's a conversation perhaps for another day. So over to you, Benga, for your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. So glad to be here, and great to see that we're talking a lot more across silos. And the reason I say that is because even within those of us who work in human rights, there's almost always a silo of those who work in traditional human rights and those who work in digital rights. But I think if last year, 2020 taught us anything, it is the fact that all of our work come together at various times to address challenges bigger than any of the sum of our parts. We're talking about data privacy because development requires data, but if you're not careful, that process can lead to abuse. The work we do at Paradigm Initiative is focused on 2 areas. It's focused on digital inclusion, which is where we started. We just basically wanted to train young people so they can understand tech and get jobs and live better lives. But as we began to do that, we realized that policy played a major role. You could train as much as possible, but if the policy environment is not right, then you would have the example of the young man in Cameroon who was great at his programming, had learned, and was just about to submit what was a competition that it was part of, and then he had to travel to another city to do it. He traveled, got to submit his competition, and then shortly after that, Cameroon shut down the internet. Now that was interesting, because when this young man eventually won this Google award, of course you can trust that Cameroon celebrated him as a good example of young people. But wait a second, if you did not, if you shut down the internet before this guy submitted, what was his entry for the competition, he would not have won. And I think it's not even just about entry to for competitions. In Gambia, for example, and we focused on this case in one of our case studies, I think in 2017, when we were discussing, 2017 or 2018, when we were discussing at a digital rights workshop, there was the case of a woman who, during the internet shutdowns in Gambia, was unable to reach healthcare services, and delivery situation went complicated. And there was, emergency became a problem, and it became, sad news at the end of the day. And these were some of the reasons why we began to see a connection between lived experiences and many of the policy decisions that were not right respecting, that were being taken by, by many governments. And that, of course, made sure that we began to work a lot more in digital rights. Last year, we began a study of 20 countries, and we were looking at things ranging from COVID-19 to data privacy, to human rights and literary, to freedom of expression. And across the 20 countries, I can say 3 clear things that we found. Number one is that majority of the countries took advantage of COVID-19 to pursue data collection regimes that were not within legal frameworks. So these are countries that don't have data protection laws, but maybe have some grant from one regional institution or the other to pursue, data collection processes. Of course, many of them now have conditions. You have to get the data protection law before you can get the last part of your money, which is great. But many of them took advantage of COVID-19 and the health implications and the fact that we're fighting a virus, we need to flatten the curve, to begin to collect a lot more data and using things like public order, public safety, and national security as an excuse when asked about data protection. The second thing that we saw was that in a few of the countries, and if you check the London report, you will see that many countries also took advantage of 2019, 2020, and of many of the things that happened. They took advantage of that to create laws that made illegal things legal. And I'll explain what I mean. A practical example will be Cameroon, Ethiopia, and Nigeria, who then said, well, there's COVID-19, people are spreading fake news, so let's end fake news. And by ending fake news, what it then did was to introduce bills. Thankfully, it didn't pass in Nigeria and in Cameroon. Then to introduce bills that basically said that people who were journalists and who were sharing information about COVID-19, including asking questions, including investigative pieces, could then be arrested and sent to jail without a court order. And that we found very worrying, and I'm glad that many of the countries, in many of the countries, civil society pushed back. But the thought and the importance that we're beginning to see right now is that governments are now a lot more emboldened to take action with retroactive laws. Let me give you a practical and ongoing example in Nigeria. On June 4, the government of Nigeria, with a tweet, announced that Twitter was suspended in Nigeria. You can't beat the irony, right? And when questions were asked on what law, because what they did was to reach out to send a memo to telecom companies and ISPs to shut down access to twitter.com and all variations of it, the app, mobile version, and everything. And then we, by the way, Paradigm Initiative has sent a freedom of information request to them, asking them the question, under what law did you do that? Because the regulator requires a court warrant, at least court permission, to be able to do that. But apparently they were able to bully the telcos and the ISPs to do that. If you follow the Nigerian telecom story, you will know that MTN was fined, north of $2 billion. They eventually paid, I think, $500 million in fines, because they were accused of having unregistered numbers on their network that were being used by terrorists. So everyone is about their licenses right now. So they complied. But the interesting thing is that before the government announced this suspension, the courts were on strike. The courts actually just called off their strike to resume on Monday. So it basically means that when the courts resume on Monday, and you can quote me on this, when courts resume on Monday, government will then get a legal notice that is backdated to justify what they've done. It will not be the first time that this has happened. And I'm glad that it's been challenged, because the courts were closed. A few colleagues and I, and other organizations have approached the ECOWAS court. One case, 2 cases have been filed. The 3rd case is going, right now. But these are the kind of things that we're seeing. And I think one thing is very clear from all these 3 trends. It is that governments are using every incident to pursue the agenda that they have. So if the agenda of the government is to have an open internet, open data conversations and things like that, COVID-19 provided that opportunity. But if the agenda is clamped down, then also COVID-19 and anything that has to do with data then provides, that opportunity. As I speak to you, The National Broadcasting Commission in Nigeria has now published in newspapers today. Thankfully, this wasn't shared on Twitter because it would have been funny. They have now required for Twitter to come back. Legally in Nigeria, they have asked them to come register. They've invoked a very creative part of the National Broadcasting Code to say that all over the top services, all social media platforms are now regarded as broadcasters, and they must get a register in Nigeria and get licenses. And so, you know, if this isn't challenged, apparently, this continues to help further the agenda. And this is why I say, for example, that it's great to talk, you know, across silos, so that when we have conversations about development, we can also know that, yes, development is something we should pursue, but if we do not take care of the policy issues, some of them are rising because of the development agenda that we have. We could be taking one step of development forward and 2 steps of rights violations backward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Benga. Some really, really pertinent examples there that throw up very, very interesting and challenging questions. I'm very conscious of time, and I do want us to move to a broader conversation, because I think that will give an opportunity to people who've been listening patiently to respond. And just for your information, Al and Rose, there is a question specifically for Kenya in the Q&A. So please do start to think about your responses to that, because I will ask you to comment on it. But before we do that, Benga, while you were talking, I was reflecting on the title of this session, which was Aligning Values Across Community of Practice Towards a Rights-Based Post-COVID Data Revolution. And the one word that kept on coming back to my mind as you were talking, when I was thinking about, well, how do we actually do that? How do we work across private sector companies like Sergo Foundation, across statistical entities, across the global partnership, which has to balance the interests of so many different actors, across grassroots activists like you and Al, across consultants like me who work in the development sector? How do we do that? And the one word that it all comes back to in my mind is trust. And it's all about fostering trust. Fostering trust in the fact that data will be processed fairly, equitably, accountably, transparently, in a participatory way. So I'd love to focus our discussion now a bit in a more forward-looking way on you know, what's the world going to look like post-COVID? What are the steps that we can take as development practitioners, as human rights activists, in your case, Benga, and you know, as private sector representatives? What are the steps that we can take to foster that trust that's going to be needed in data governance following the pandemic? Mull on that for a moment, and I have one final question for Al that I wanted to ask him, just to kind of guide us into that conversation, because Al always makes the point of this needs to be not elitist, and it needs to be grounded in the everyday. And over the last couple of weeks, Al, I've seen a number of videos come out of the Open Institute, just asking people on the street what they think data is, what they think data governance is, why data rights matter. They've all been in Kiswahili, so I've not understood them. But what's the word on the street in Kenya? In 30 seconds, you know, do people trust how their data is being used by the Kenyan government in COVID? Just a very broad landscape picture. I know it's anecdotal. Mola, don't kill us in terms of the statistical method behind this, but just anecdotally, what's the word on the street in terms of people's perception of how their data is being used in response to COVID? And other panelists, please think a bit about what we've been talking about in terms of trust, and attendees, please do write in any questions that you might have in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Number one, because it helps me to pawn the questions by Steve Biko off to Rose, who I feel is more qualified to answer that question. So we've been having this campaign on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and where we've been actively engaging, in particular with young people. I think so far we've actively had engagements with about 600,000 young people in Kenya so far. And what has been interesting is that at one point our comms team went out to the ground, went out into marketplaces, and simply ask people, so what do you understand by data? What do you understand by data protection? What do you understand by any of these things? Even before we get to a place where we can trust. Now, colloquially in Kenya, data that you use on your phone, that you buy from your telco so that you can be able to browse the internet, that's the data that they understand. And so for that, we call it colloquially as bundles. So when you ask them what is data, they would say data is bundles as a number one. When we ask them questions like, do they know what cookies are? They say, apart from the cookies that are biscuits, I don't know. And that's actually transcribing some of the videos that you are referring to, which you can see on our Facebook page. People don't really understand what any of these things mean, and even the ones that do did not really see that there's an important thing, there's anything weird about them, for example, posting a picture of their children on Facebook. I mean, Facebook is mine and Jenna is my friend, and so Jenna is the only person who can see it. But then I don't realize that also my profile is public. So literally not just Jenna can see my children, but everybody can see my children, and that they can use it. Or I take a picture next to my car with a license plate clearly showing, and with my estate, my apartment building clearly showing in the background, so that now I have told people where I live and what car I drive, sort of thing. People haven't really thought about the dangers or the sensitivities of such actions. So that is where we started the campaign from. By them going to the street and engaging with the public like that, told us where to start the campaign from. And we started the campaign from definitions, from breaking it down. In fact, I think majority of the campaign has been about, do you know that there are people called hackers who are out to get your data? Do you know that when you write your name in the book of truth, it can be used against you? Do you know that your children can be kidnapped because of the picture that you posted on Facebook? Those sort of things. Do you know that it's important for you to read terms and conditions of, like the fintech apps that you use? Because if you don't read the terms and conditions and you don't pay your loan, then your friends are going to be called by the fintech app because you've given them the data, not just of yourself, but also of your friends. Because this is what happens. When I take a loan on one of the fintech apps that have become prevalent in Kenya, and also the betting companies, what they do is that as part of the fine print, I have also given them access to my contact list on my phone. And what they do is that when I don't pay my loan, Benga is going to receive a call out of the blue, and he's going to be told, can you tell Alkags to go and pay? What they don't realize that Benga is a person that I went to Paradigm to go and interview for a job, and therefore he's considering me for a job. That's how he ends up being in my contact list. But he's been called to be told that I don't pay my debts, which means I don't even have a job, which means I can't even pay my. Can you see the challenge that is there? So these are the big issues that we did with when we were doing the question of the campaign. And it's very, I mean, I could take the whole day to tell you about this, but I don't think it would be fair on me to do that. Unless, everybody else can just sit down and I can tell you all about this.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Al. It's really helpful. And I think the message that's emerging from across both the panels, and just to be clear, let's move now into the question component of this. So again, I just remind our attendees that if they'd like to ask a question, there is a Q&A tab on the webinar function. So please do put your questions in there, and I'll then relay them to the specific panelists. And these are questions for both panels, by the way, so you don't have to limit them just to the second one. But just coming back to some of the points that have been raised here, what seems to be the case is that COVID-19 has been an exacerbator of underlying issues and longer standing problems. There are some specific things which have emerged as a result of COVID. We heard from Mola and from Sema and others about the need for more granular data, more timely data that can help to respond to those, to the pandemic situation. And then from a rights point of view, what COVID is doing is it's exacerbating lots of issues which have been underlying for a long time about issues around data minimization that Al has raised there. what should or shouldn't be done with specific types of data, how you regulate that, and then the intersection of our rights in the physical world and our rights in cyberspace, as described so succinctly by Benga as well. So I'd like to come back to this theme of trust, because I do think that if we want to focus this discussion on anything, if we're talking across communities, that trust is absolutely key here. So while we wait for some more questions from the audience, and Rose, don't worry, I will come to you in a few moments to answer Steve's question. But while we wait for some more questions to come in, I did just want to ask some of our panelists, including those from the first panel, what their views are around how we can foster trust in the use of data and its protection in the post-COVID world generally. And, you know, this is an open question, so please do come in with any thoughts or reflections that you might have. Sema, I think, if I'm not mistaken, you've come off mute. Please go ahead, the floor is yours.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, Tom. I think trust is really important. I mean, one way we can build trust is really help people understand how do we use that data. And this goes back to Al-Kag's survey and what you've heard from all the 60,000 or 600,000, sorry, I forgot the number, people use survey. But it's clear that people really don't understand how their data is being used, right? So when they're providing data through these various platforms, they just have no idea how that data is being used and how that it can be used. So I think we need much more transparency in terms of how data is being used. And as an organization, as ourselves, who collects data and uses data, you know, what organizations like ourselves should be doing more and more, just really being very transparent. How is that data being used? So I think that's one important element of building trust. The other thing I wanted to say is around those terms and conditions, again, that you pointed out. I mean, you know, you sign up in an app, you get this window of terms of conditions, you automatically opt in, right? Because who has the time, you know, A, the time to read those terms and conditions, and B, if you ever try to read those terms and conditions, no one can really understand what exactly those terms and conditions are. So I think there needs to be, and I think there is a movement of about how do you make those terms and conditions really accessible to your average person? What does it really mean? What is it that you're really opting into and giving up? So I think that's more of a legal policy framework. But yeah, essentially transparency in terms of how data used is my one answer.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I might come back to you if we have time, because I'd like to explore what you mentioned earlier as well about how you actually dealt as a company with requests from governments for personal data, and you know what the kind of steps you took to mediate that request were. But again, I don't want to put you on the spot with that, and also let's see if we have time, but I do think it's an interesting example. Is there anyone else who'd like to come in on that point on trust? Perhaps Mola, if I could call on you, because you mentioned the fundamental principles of official statistics, and because I'm a lawyer and have a good brain for remembering details, if I remember rightly, the first principle of official statistics is that you know, they will be done in a trustworthy way for the service of citizens, etc. And I've often thought actually that in this conversation around how to better manipulate and use non-traditional sources of data, as you may call them, for official statistics, that the statistical community perhaps could be a source of best practice in this regard, because you've been doing data confidentiality in countries with low capacity for data protection for very many years. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on whether there are any lessons from the statistical community on how to protect data, how to do data confidentiality well, that might be helpful for other parts of the data ecosystem. I don't know if that's clear enough or not, but please do jump in if you have any thoughts.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Tom. Let me a little bit talk about trust. I think there is a saying that trust comes on foot, but lives on horseback. You know, if you don't really give due attention to trust, it can disappear like instantly. So we need to really protect data. Like trust is through protection, through awareness, through literacy. You know, that's how what happens. And speaking of the fundamental principles of official statistics, one of the principles says that statistics can be derived from any source of data. You know, there is a room like to expand from, in addition to the surveys, censuses, and admin data, we have, I think, the principle to really explore. And the other issue we need really to look at privacy critically is that our sources of data are households, institutions, and individuals. If we don't have the understanding, the trust, data, the statistics that we are producing, the data we are producing will not have the quality we look at. Like non-response rates might be a lot, like when we are going to the households, because we cannot force households to respond to some of the surveys. Like in some cases, we have census is mainly mandatory, but surveys are not usually mandatory. It's like the will of the respondents to respond. So I really would like to stress the fact that trust is a very critical component of statistical data processes and collection production process.
Thank you very much. And I think that, yeah, as you say, there's a lot to learn there. That, you know, trust is something that comes over time, and I think that the extensive amount of time that the statistics community has spent in helping to foster trust amongst other parts of government and amongst society in the use of statistical products can show lessons for all of us. And as you say, it requires literacy, awareness, and the rest of it. We do have several questions now from participants, which is great. And I'd ask our speakers to take a look at those questions, and if there are ones that they'd like to answer in writing, to please do that. And other ones, if they'd like to address verbally, to also, you know, to just come off mute or send me a little message and let me know. I see that Al has his hand up from the panelists to speak. Al, please do go ahead, but please do just be brief, because I'd like to hear from some of our other panelists as well on a couple of questions. So please come in.
Very well. Very well. I'll speak for only about 30 minutes. What I was going to say is, you know, and this probably relates with the question, has COVID highlighted significant shortcomings in data collection processes, and tying also to the conversation Mola has just had right now in terms of building trust within statistical systems. I think the one big thing that I advocate lately for statisticians to do is to invest a lot more in communication. If you look at the efforts that you know, NSOs, organizations that deal with data and statistics, that sort of thing, all of these organizations tend not to invest in communication. And by communication is not just releasing the report, but in actually breaking down the data, breaking down the report, making sure that it's an accessible language, and making sure it looks beautiful enough for people to want to look at it, investing in video and other ways in which data can be visualized and can be made accessible to the public. So the big thing that I just wanted to jump in and put in here is, please invest in communication, and please invest in innovative communication that is accessible to people. If you advertise in the newspapers, then you don't really reach people. But if you put it in social media, then people are able to access. That's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I do see a couple of people with hands up, Jenna and Benga, but before we turn to you, I'd like to just turn to Rose to see whether she would like to say anything on the issue of trust, or whether she'd like to answer Steve's question. And also I'd ask, you know, whether you have any comments or thoughts as well on what Benga was saying earlier, because what Benga was raising was a whole host of complicated political and regulatory issues in Nigeria and elsewhere, which, you know, raise really serious questions about the role of different institutions across government. And I'd love to hear your thoughts as a representative of the Data Protection Commissioner's Office in Kenya about how you see your office's role in those kinds of conflicts in future. But, you know, I don't want to put you on the spot with that. If you do have any thoughts you'd like to share, that would be great. But if you have any comments on trust or would like to answer Steve's question, please do come in.
Sure. Thank
and then
you so
Jenna,
much for that.
and then Benga.
Thank you, Tom. In regards to issues on trust, I think Sema mentioned, I think, quite concisely issues in regards to transparency. And I think coming from a data protection perspective, transparency is one of the key principles of data protection, but there is also an issue of awareness. If we don't create enough awareness, then whether we're a government and non-governmental agencies, private sector, a CSO, it doesn't matter what we do, whether we're transparent. If we don't have awareness as to what exactly we're doing, then that issue of trust doesn't really come into play. So there's a human aspect that cannot be ignored when it comes to trust relations and transparency in that regard. To answer Steve's questions, I'll just briefly talk to all three of them. The first one was in regards to the exemption of national security, which is undefined, and the issue of public interest, which is also undefined. One of the things that I mentioned when we started is that there are draft regulations that touch on the issues of national security and public interest, or something that we've defined as public good. When it comes to national security, there are national security organs that are recognized in the Constitution of Kenya, and so and there are procedures that this national security organs go through in regards to any investigations that they have or in conducting of their mandates. And so in the Data Protection Act and in the regulations, we have recognized that this national security organs will at times be given either through the courts, usually through the courts, and mandates to disregard certain aspects of the Data Protection Act, and that is something that is constitutionally mandated. So in that regard, we have recognized that. But there are other actors that will look at national security, and in this way, we have sought to cover that by having these organizations actually seek exemptions for national security, and this will be done by the Cabinet Secretary in charge of ICT in consultation with the Office of Data Protection Commissioner and the Data Commissioner in alone. I will touch on the issue of independence of the office, the Data Commissioner, which is situated under the Ministry of ICT. And to appreciate this, we really need to appreciate the structures that have been put in the government largely. In Kenya, we do have commissions that are independent commissions, and those are mandated under the Constitution of Kenya. And then we have institutions that usually come under various state departments and ministries. They are independent in nature, but unfortunately, there needs to be an oversight body. In this case, is the Ministry of ICT, which then takes the issues of accounts to the National Assembly, and that's just how some of these offices are structured. So the independent commissions sit by themselves, and these are constitutionally mandated institutions. This is such as the IEBC, which deals with electoral issues, and such institutions. But when it comes to statutory institutions, they usually have to sit within a ministry. That does not mean that they're not independent. And in fact, the Data Protection Act does give primacy to the independence of the Office of Data Protection Commissioner. And then we have issues of localization of data, and this I won't take too long on. Data localization is something that has come to be in a number of regulations, in a number of data protection acts, not just the one in Kenya. But I think there's a misunderstanding on this, and there's needs to appreciate that there are two different types of data localization strategies that are adopted by various countries. What Kenya has adopted is a less stringent one, which is a non-exclusive data localization model, which requires just one copy of the personal data to be held within the country. Now, the provisions of the regulation actually provide for two things. The first is for one copy for a processing to be effected through a data server or data center. And in looking at the comments that were given by the public, we have actually changed it to be or the storing of one copy within one server copy within data center in Kenya, not and. So it's one or the other. And because we notice that Kenya is thriving and there's room for innovation, but we also have a very budding private sector, we've restricted this data localization to entities that deal with mostly governmental entities, which most of which already have a serving copy stored within Kenya. So and that's just effectively to ensure that there's, issues of administrative requirements and recovery and such like things are not really affected, and we can have a strong digital government base within the country where such is concerned. So I'll take those. I think I've taken quite a bit of time, so I'll just leave it at that. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you very much, Rose. So a lot of information there, and really, really helpful to have that institutional breakdown. Steve, I do hope that answers your question. I just remind our panelists that there are a number of questions in the Q&A, and that you can also type answers. So if there's any question that catches your eye that you feel that you could respond to, please do type an answer, as we're running out of time shortly now as well, and our attendees have been very patient. Jenna, I'd like to turn to you. You had your hand raised, so please do jump in. And while you're making your point, I'd also ask you perhaps to consider. We have one question here which says the SDGs have data underpinning their achievement. Do you think we can realistically meet their targets and indicators by 2030, bearing in mind the challenges of collecting granular data? So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I think perhaps from your vantage point within GPSDD, it would be helpful to get an idea of where you think we are along that line as well. But do jump in with your original comments, and if you need a moment for that one, we can give you that and turn to Benga. So Jenna, then Benga. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Let me try to knit those together and do it briefly. The one point that I wanted to come in with, following on from Al's point about investing in communication, is that also we all must be investing in dialogue. And this is where I think the global partnership can add value. So one of the things we've heard a lot about as being a critical ingredient for establishing and sustaining trust is transparency. And I think inclusion, and getting at those concepts requires actually having people like Al and Benga and the community and representatives of communities sort of at the table as decisions are made. And that requires at national and local levels creating mechanisms for that to happen. So it's not always going to be the case that everything is precisely spelled out in law or regulation. Every eventuality rather can be sort of that the policy can be made for every eventuality. But I think that policy and mechanisms can be made to allow representatives, activists, community representatives, as appropriate to the context of the question being asked, to be at the table, to have that dialogue and to push back. So it's creating the space for that. And that's, I think, what we're sort of talking about. Very practically speaking, and the global partnership alone is not going to solve for that. That's really a challenge between stakeholders at national level, at local levels. But when it comes to sort of brokering partnerships, for example, around specific solutions to fill data gaps or to enable decision makers to have access to more granular or timely data, it's about, and for the global partnership, creating mechanisms that build on existing ones at national level or creating new ones that create the space for those different viewpoints to come to the table. Because I think as much as it's about communication, it's also about translation. We're speaking very different languages across sectors and across communities, and we need to really kind of get down what do we mean and what are the implications of different concepts, anonymization, ownership, etc. So this is a point I wanted to make about dialogue. The question you asked, maybe just briefly, I mean, I think that's a really good question. And I think that all stakeholders, particularly governments and national statisticians are really grappling with some of these questions of granularity. I think what I would say is that, and this is not going to be a perfectly satisfactory answer, but there's a lot of very good work going on in the world by not just by sort of official statistics actors, and not just drawing on private sector data, but at the community level by groups that are collecting information and viewpoints through what many call citizen-generated data, but other mechanisms for engaging communities to articulate their lived experience in ways that can contribute to and supplement those sort of official statistics. And it may not, that type of data may not translate into official statistics, nor may it need to, but what it does is it provides a sort of granularity and additional supplement to understand what different groups are experiencing, how they're experiencing it, whether even the questions that are being asked and the methods that are being used to collect data are in fact perhaps reproducing inequalities, and really getting at some of those some of the underlying questions that need to be answered to really understand whether we're leaving no one behind in that broad sense of the word, whether we're achieving health outcomes for all, education outcomes for all, et cetera. So thanks, Tom. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Jenna. Really, really great points. And I love that last point that you're making there. There's a huge amount that I'm aware of going on around ocean conservation and marine conservation and things like that engage people directly. And I think that that's an incredibly good point to make to that question. So thank you. Mola, I do see your hand up, but I do want to turn to Benga, who had his hand up earlier, just to very, very briefly make a couple of points, and then perhaps also just to turn to Davis, who's been very quiet in a few moments as well, just to say, just to share his reflections. Please do bear in mind, we literally have about 1 or 2 minutes left, so please do keep your comments brief. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. It's in my interest to finish in less than a minute because I really have to leave, for something. Innovative ways and trust are both related. And I think there's a proverb from Nigeria, from one of the politicians who people hope will be president, but didn't become one, that you can't shave a man in his absence. And I think what we do many times is that we shave people's heads in their absence. We create policies and laws and bills without consulting the people. And so when we give it to them, they don't trust it. And they have absolute rights not to trust that. So we need to begin to invite people before we shave their head so that it's not in their absence. I wanted to speak very quickly to funding constraints. Maybe not actually. I know we need multi-year national fundings. We'll talk more about that. But in terms of political will, I think 2 clear things that we need. One is citizen action. We cannot roll over every time governments say, don't do this. We need to ask more questions. But apart from citizens, we need more activist institutions. Telecom companies and banks need to ask questions of their regulators instead of complying all the time. Otherwise, one day, they would ask you to do the things that will kill your business, and you would say, yes, roll over and die.
Thank you very much, Benga, for that very optimistic ending there, but I think very good points made very well. Mola, I do see your hand up. We are now just 1 minute over. I'd ask people who can just perhaps remain for a couple of minutes. Davis, would you like to say a few words? And then Mola, one final thought before I just conclude with a couple of words as well.
No, thanks, Tom. And I mean, from all these discussions, you can clearly see that how complex this conversation and the intricacies of the lenses that each one of us is actually wearing, and I think that in a sense means that if we're going to build a movement and build consensus around some of these issues, there's a lot more work to be done. And I think Benga's very practical examples of how this is working, and of course engaging with governments, because often they're excluded from these conversations. But having Ross here to actually say it from a government perspective, we need to pull in a lot more of people who are dealing with this the really difficult issues here. And of course, building consensus means that Restore Data Rights, the Data Values Project, will continue to have a much more longer term conversation and opportunity to really build that movement and consensus. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. Mola, just a few seconds, and then I'd like to just say a couple of things before we end.
Just to quickly respond on the SDGs progress, whether we are meeting the target by 2030. I think we did an assessment on Africa and also at sub-regional level. It looks like, just to give a fact here, we are only meeting goal 14 in Africa, which is life below water, even though the data is not as good as we expect, but we are making progress on 15 of the goals, but not sufficient enough to meet the target by 2030. But we are also sliding back on goal 16, peace and justice, which we really need to reverse the trend. This is a statistical fact we have based on our methodologies. And I think just one brief point is that when it comes to SDG, we always say 247 indicators now, but they are not 247. With the detail, the disaggregation in our assessment, they are close to 2,000 variables that we have to collect on a regular basis. Not only annually, we need like now, frequently, quarterly and monthly data. So it is so a big challenge when it comes to SDGs data collection.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's really interesting to have that snapshot and a reminder of just how big the task is. We're a few minutes over, so it just remains for me to say thank you very much to all of our panelists and to the Global Partnership for helping to host and organize this event. I think it's been an incredibly valuable conversation. It has been a bit broad, and as Davis said, it's thrown up lots of different angles and dimensions and issues to consider. But I hope it's the first of many conversations of this kind across communities. So I'm actually not worried or disappointed that it's been broad. It's been good to hear lots of different perspectives. And I think the task for those of us within the Restore Data Rights movement and for those managing the Data Values Project is to now think about how all of these threads fit together and what the next concrete steps are. So I look forward very much to keeping the conversation going. Apologies to attendees if we didn't answer all of your questions. Please do follow up on Twitter or by email or any other way if you have any other questions. I think that this will be the first event of several where we can perhaps dive into some of these issues in a bit more detail. So thank you all again very much for your time. And have a lovely morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Take care.